Devourer. Chapter 250, Forest Campaign. Minuvai sat silent in the trees as her fellows approached the external perimeter. This fight was going to be a bloody one. The Loyalists were deeply entrenched. Once the defections hit critical mass, the Elders pulled all remaining Loyalists back to the secondary line. The border with the primordial font and Old Valyria has been pulled back to a more defensible position. Unheard of until this point, but with the border with Old Valyria stuck in a standoff, it is not inconceivable that the enemy will attempt a two-pronged attack. Sure enough, once HTE pullback began, the forces on the Valyrian border moved in. With the elves abandoning ground, the forest lost its bite against invaders. Minuave peered across the large river. It was almost 100 meters, and she took out her map to check the status. It was a piece of magical parchment that showed the current rough situations across the front. The red arrows symbolized Imperial forces, green shields symbolized Minuvai's rebels, blue shields symbolized Elven loyalists. The fighting is heaviest along the second defensive line west, where her rebel forces are locked in a brutal struggle to cross a wide, treacherous river. The loyalists have fortified the banks, turning every attempt at passage into a costly gamble. Yet this sector is meant to draw their focus, and General Audius has committed his most disciplined veterans to hold the line, bleed the defenders, and deny them the chance to maneuver. Meanwhile, reinforcements are advancing from the east to strike the Loyalists' eastern line. That front is anchored along a narrower stretch of river, leaving it vulnerable to a decisive breakthrough. This flanking force, cavalry supported and reinforced with siege elements, has been assembled to shatter the enemy's defenses in one swift push, cutting off retreat and collapsing their position. At the same time, Audius is preparing a third offensive, an amphibious strike along the eastern coast of the Elven lands. Imperial Marines and Naga shock troops will spearhead the assault, bypassing coastal defenses to disrupt supply chains, cripple ports, and open a deep front in Loyalist territory. Audius' campaign was a masterclass in layered pressure, an intricate trap designed to stretch the Loyalists until their strongest fortifications became liabilities. The western line was bait, the eastern assault the hammer, and the coastal landing the coup de grace. Once these strikes converged, the Loyalist command would face encirclement and the collapse of their entire front. Minuvai grimaced as she recalled the strategy. Audius called it the Grand Battle Plan Doctrine, a sweeping design supplemented by the Hive's Mass Assault Doctrine and Mobile Warfare Doctrine. Even in theory, it was terrifying. The Avalonian Empire was unlike any other nation. Its numbers, resources, and technology were unparalleled, and its sheer mass alone was unmatched anywhere in the world. What other realm could field the overwhelming numbers of a humane empire, the naval supremacy of the Naga, the engineering mastery of the dwarves, the raw destructive potential of the vampires, and the iron resilience of the lizardkin, all under one banner? And this did not even account for the Hive, a force that likely outstripped the combined strength of all the rest. Minuvai knew the truth. Avalon was no mere great power. It was a global superpower, the strongest faction in the known world by a wide margin. She crouched on a branch, peering through the mist toward the opposite bank. The Loyalists had turned the far side of the river into a fortress, their archers firing from high in the canopy. Golden arrows flashed through gaps in the leaves, their runes glowing faintly as they struck tree trunks or sank into the dirt. Minuvai's rebels responded in kind, their own sharpshooters hidden among the branches on her side, their enchanted arrows threading through fog and foliage. Below them, Imperial riflemen were dug deep into trenches, reinforced with logs, firing bolts of magic from behind thick tree trunks. The river was a 100-meter-wide barrier, its surface scattered with debris and glowing fragments of spent enchantmented equipment. Fire traded across the water in steady rhythms, more about suppression than bloodshed. Few fell, but neither side relented, each volley serving to pin the other in place. The forest was alive with the crack of spell shot and the hiss of arrows, a low, constant thunder beneath the canopy. Minuvai's sharp eyes caught movement at the river's edge below. Through drifting mist, a line of squat, angular shapes emerged from the tree line. Dwarven landing craft, their hulls plated with rune-etched steel, creaked forward on heavy wheels before sliding into the water with splashes that shattered the tense rhythm of the firefight. The craft sat low in the river, armored panels raised to shield the troops packed inside. Steam hissed from rune vents as hidden engines churned beneath the surface, propelling them toward the far bank. Dwarves hunched over the controls, their thick armor glinting faintly, while human riflemen knelt behind the side plates, firing disciplined bursts of magical bolts to suppress enemy archers. Each shot lit the mist with red flashes, slamming into the tree line opposite. Golden arrows streaked from loyalist nests high in the canopy, striking sparks off the armored hulls of the landing craft. Wards flared with each impact, glowing briefly before fading. Imperial rifles answered from the trenches, their spellfire cutting through mist and shadow as the craft surged forward. A sudden flare of light from the far tree line caught Minuvei's eye. An elven ballista, hidden in the canopy, fired a massive rune-etched bolt that tore across the river. It struck the lead craft, detonating in a deafening blast that split the vessel apart, throwing soldiers into the water. Dwarves and humans flailed in the current as arrows rained down, and the burning wreck drifted downstream like a beacon of failure. Then the river itself came alive. Pale, chitinous forms broke the surface as the Hive erupted from submerged tunnels, screeching as they rushed the far bank. Loyalists shifted fire immediately, shredding the first wave in a storm of arrows and magic, but the swarm kept coming, sacrificing itself to sow chaos. Amid the distraction, the surviving landing craft pushed through the barrage and slammed onto the shore. Dwarves in heavy armor surged down ramps, followed by Imperial rifle squads and vampires moving with eerie precision. They fanned out, driving the defenders back step by step as Minuvei's elves provided cover fire from the treetops. The Hive piled up in heaps at the water's edge, but their assault had broken the Loyalists' formation long enough for a foothold to form. The riverbank was now a contested beachhead, thick with smoke, blood, and magic. On the near bank, Imperial engineers sprang into motion. Teams fired enchanted towing bolts across the river, each cable locking into place under dwarven hands. Anchors glowed with fresh runes as the lines went taut, humming with mana. Soon, mithril plates etched with binding spells were sliding along the cables, each segment locking into place with heavy clicks as a bridge began to take shape over the misty water. Arrows and spell bolts hammered the work crews, but sharpshooters and riflemen laid down steady covering fire. Hive corpses littered the shoreline, forcing Loyalist archers to shift position and slowing their volleys. Plate by plate, the glowing bridge extended toward the embattled beachhead, a silver path of steel and magic that promised to turn this brutal crossing into a full-scale assault. A sharp crack split through the forest, louder than the steady rhythm of rifles and arrows. Minuvei's eyes snapped to the tree line where a hidden elven ballista fired, its glowing bolt streaking across the misty river. The projectile struck the bridge midspan, erupting in a deafening explosion. The cables snapped with a violent whip, glowing runes flaring and dying as shattered plates crashed into the water. In moments, the crossing was gone, leaving only burning debris drifting downstream. "Bridge is down," came the cry, but the chaos made it obvious. Loyalist fire intensified, arrows and spell bolts hammering the exposed beachhead. Minuvei's elves returned fire from the canopy, but the defenders pressed hard, forcing Imperial forces back to the river's edge. A red flare signaled the retreat. Landing craft surged forward, ramps slamming down as soldiers scrambled aboard under covering fire. Dwarves raised shields, rifle squads fired in tight bursts, and officers shouted orders over the roar of magic and steel. A ballista shot splashed wide, rocking one craft as engines pushed hard to pull away from the bank. "Cover them! Get them out!" Minuvei barked, loosing an arrow at a Loyalist marksman before dropping to another branch to direct her rebels. Minutes later, the boats were cutting through smoke and mist, retreating under fire. The shoreline was abandoned, littered with wreckage, blood, and the failed remains of the assault. The Loyalists' hold on the far bank remained unbroken. Minuvei grimaced. She knew how deadly her kin were on home ground, and even the mighty Imperial army was beginning to show cracks under their defense. Audius stood over the campaign table, lamplight glinting off the polished map. Casualty reports lay neatly arranged: 4,000 dead, 14,000 wounded, and 2,000 awaiting magical treatment. The numbers were acceptable losses. The Western Front was stable, and the failed river assault had served its true purpose: to pin the Elven loyalists and convince them the Imperials were committed to breaking the West. His gaze lingered on the fortified riverbank marked with Elven loyalist positions. Ballistae, treetop archers, and layered magical defenses had stopped the crossing exactly as expected. Even the Hive had been unleashed there, not in desperation, but to strengthen the illusion that this was the decisive front. The Elven loyalists believed they had blunted the Empire's main attack, and that was exactly what he wanted. Audius shifted his attention eastward. That flank was thinly manned, guarded by a river as well, but narrower and far easier to cross. Imperial reinforcements were already on the march, columns of soldiers and siege units moving under cover of the Western battle. The Elven loyalists remained focused on holding their victory, unaware of the storm gathering to the east. He tapped an armored finger on a marked salient in the Elven loyalist line along the Western Front. "Maintain pressure on the west," he said evenly. "Keep them pinned. When the east falls, this position will become untenable. The Western Front will have no choice but to retreat or risk the salient being cut off." Audius stood over the map table, fingers resting on its edge. "Adjutant!" A young officer in polished armor stepped forward, posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. "My lord." Audius pointed to a sector of the salient on the Western Front, the tip of his armored finger clicking against the map. "Prepare another river crossing here, minimal commitment. Make it convincing, then pull back." "Yes, my lord." Audius shifted his hand, tapping a nearby stretch of the defensive line. "Lighten fire after withdrawal. Hold in case they counter." The adjutant saluted crisply, boots sinking slightly into the packed earth of the command tent as he turned to leave. The soft rustle of canvas and distant shouts of messengers filtered in as Audius stayed motionless, his glowing eyes fixed on the map, already calculating the eastern advance while the officer hurried off to relay orders. Just as Audius shifted his attention to another stretch of the line, he felt a powerful presence nearby. He glanced up and met a pair of sterling eyes set above shimmering pink scales. "Didn't expect the great beast to send you," he said as Mihaela stepped into the command tent. Her sinuous lizardkin disguise was flawless, every movement smooth and deliberate. "Good to see you too, Grand General," she replied dryly. Audius raised a brow as Crownless followed her in, silent and emotionless, clad in chitin armor and a faceless helm. "Quite the force, then," Audius remarked. "The great beast must be growing impatient to send you Malagaros and that thing." He nodded toward Crownless. "Crownless," Mihaela said airily, resting a hand on the hilt of one of her rapiers. "That's what they're calling it." "If you can even call that a name," Audius muttered. "The great beast named it," Mihaela replied as she sat down. "That is one of his better choices. He once insisted the young princess's hivehound be called Spots instead of Spot because it had more than one black spot." "Rational," Audius said calmly. "Yes, the two of you would get along if naming things were a hobby," Mihaela said dryly. Audius only raised a brow in response. The two stared at each other in silence for a moment before he turned slightly toward an adjutant. "Fetch her some wine," he said. The officer bowed quickly and slipped out of the tent, leaving the map table heavy with unspoken words. "Never knew you to be the hospitable type," Mihaela said. "Please, I was a member of the vampire courts," Audius replied, his tone even. "We know how to be hospitable, even if we rarely bother." The tent flap stirred as the adjutant returned, setting a bottle and glass before her. Mihaela lifted it, swirled the red, and gave a faint smile. Cathian red. Expensive to bring this far from the vineyards. She took a slow sip. "Should I be worried about poison?" Audius leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on her. "I have nothing strong enough to kill a draconian, and certainly not you." Mihaela smirked over the rim of the glass. "So you admit you've thought about it?" Audius allowed the barest curve of a smile. "I think about many things." "Good, I would be disappointed otherwise." "Now then, on to business," Mihaela said before downing the glass of wine. Agreed. As of now, the plan is to wait until the second army reaches the eastern flank. After that, you and Crownless will strike at the eastern edge of the salient. A breakthrough there will serve as a spearhead for encirclement and should force a rapid retreat, preserving lives on both sides. Remember, we do not actually want to kill the elves, only take control, Audius explained but paused. Unless, of course, I get orders to hold and not attack, due to some grander strategy I am not privy to. Mahala raised a brow. Yes, I know it sounds odd coming from me, Audius continued, but strategy dictates tactics, and knowing your temperament, mercy, retraint, or both will not be much of an issue, will it? Mahala gave a slight nod, then looked over the map. For the rebels, best we keep Minuvai alive. Most likely she will be running the place once this is over. Indeed, I have tasked Abriah to guard her. She will be a useful pawn against the angels, Audius said, and Mahala nodded in agreement. Audius glanced up at Mahala before speaking again. As the old wisdom goes, tribute does not flow from a dead race. Chapter 251. Into the fog. I flew above the mountains, wings slicing through thin air, and looked down at the narrow valley. The whole place was lighting up like a flare. Ether contamination was heavy. Whatever hit this land had to be powerful enough to carve a valley straight through a mountain range. I banked lower, folding my wings slightly to control the descent, and dropped into one of the worst spots, a jagged offshoot branching from the main valley, probably an ether arc that had punched through the mountains. The ground shimmered with that eerie ether blue, the kind that clung to irradiated rock. No wildlife, not even moss. It made sense. Adaptation here would be random, pointless. At least the primordial font is a full ecosystem sealed inside a mountain range. This was just a wound left to rot. I slowed, hovering above the broken terrain, and scanned the walls, their glow sharper through my ether vision. Nasty place. Might be worth figuring out what happened here, I muttered, angling downward before darting toward the nearest wall. Alone, unmonitored, I could shift freely. My upper right arm rippled, bones shifting under the skin before reshaping into a spike. I braced against the uneven rock and drove it in with a sharp thrust. Ether signatures flared in my mind, overwhelming for a moment. The attack that scarred this valley was ancient, very ancient, judging from the script woven into the residue. Chaotic, crude, more brute force than finesse. Classic old-world magic. They never had to be inventive the way the younger, weaker races did. Efficiency is a tactic born of scarcity, not strength. The ancients had no shortage of power. Any insights, my king? Nafas asked through the hive mind. Ritual magic. This wasn't fired by a firstborn, I said, turning and brushing dust from my arm as it shifted back to its normal form. My gaze swept across the blasted terrain, measuring distance, tracing scars in the rock. This might be how the old races managed to kill the firstborn, I added, mapping the signature deeper into my mind. I lingered, letting the lattice of power settle into my thoughts. The more I traced it, the clearer the pattern of disorder became. Modern scripts are built like equations, efficient lines folding in on themselves to preserve energy, careful loops that return ether back into the flow. This was nothing like that. The old races had forced ether to obey by brute assertion, cramming it into jagged scripts that bled power from every seam. It should have collapsed under its own instability, but instead the waste became part of the weapon. Every leaking thread turned into pressure. Every break in structure became another spark feeding the surge. The spell burned itself alive, and in doing so unleashed devastation that no efficient script could hope to match. Even after centuries, the rock carried the echo of the strike, the ground itself etched with its memory. The chaos still lingered in the residue, unstable, like a fire that refused to burn out. It was like a crude cannon, thrown together without care for efficiency and fired as if it were a doomsday weapon. Wasteful, but devastating. I scanned the valley, its straight scar cutting clean through the mountains. The trajectory was easy to follow. The spell had been unleashed in a single brutal line, with no precision and no control, only overwhelming force. This must be what killed the firstborn in the Vulpina wastes. I flexed my wings, feeling the cords of power coil tight within them, then poured essence into every vein and sinew. The world blurred as I fired into the air like an arrow loosed from a bow. Wind screamed past me as I ripped through the sky and angled toward the wastelands of the desert. Below, the valley yawned open, unnerving in its unnatural geometry. It ran in a ruler straight line that no river or hand of nature could have carved. Its walls shimmered with a sickly sheen, jagged slopes of obsidian irradiated by lingering ether. The black glass caught the light in odd ways, as if it was simultaneously reflective and yet not at the same time. As I flew, I noticed some movement below and engaged my active camouflage. Don't want anyone noticing me. Might cause a panic. Then I spotted this crumbling city in the distance. This is a big one. I darted toward it, wings beating in short bursts of power that kept me streaking across the horizon. From a few kilometers out, the outline of the city came into view, crowned by a rusted sign hammered into the outer wall, Risen City. So this was the so-called largest city in the region. Bigger than the border towns, bigger than the half-sunken settlements that clung to the fog's edge. Close enough to the ether fog that it could creep close eventually, but far enough that the death haze didn't choke it outright. A precarious balance. I slowed, circling high overhead. From above, the sprawl was obvious, a patchwork shanty of rusted metal sheets, sun-bleached tarps, and rotted planks stitched together into homes. Smoke rose from crooked chimneys, curling against the desert wind. The outer line was ringed by a wall, tall and ugly but solid. Scavenged girders, broken stone slabs, boulders mortared in with black pitch. A fortress born not of design, but of desperation and sheer necessity. The city pulsed with life even from this distance, a raw mass of movement and noise contained within its rough shell. It looked alive but uneasy, like a beast with its back pressed to the wall, baring its teeth at the wasteland around it. The steel sheets stood out immediately. In every other land I had crossed, walls were stone, timber, or layered with enchantments. That was the rhythm of this world, magical logic, not industry. Yet here, jagged plates of steel had been hammered together into barricades and roofs, an appearance ripped from somewhere else entirely. To anyone born here, it might only look crude, but to me it was hauntingly familiar. Steel sheets like these belonged to my past life, the world I had left behind. The way they bent, the way rust ate into their surface, all of it carried the mark of industry. The kind of thing that spoke of furnaces, presses and machines that should not exist in this world at all. It gave the Vulpes a kind of unique edge. Their use of guns was not just a strange cultural quirk, it was tied to this visual truth. Where others leaned on runes and steel-forged blades, the Vulpes inherited the remnants of an industrial age, however fractured it had become. Guns, steel plates, scavenged machines, these were not accidents. They were the natural continuation of a society that reached for tools no other people even considered. To the wider world, they looked like an aberration. But circling over Risen City, I saw the real divide. A culture born of industry, surrounded on all sides by a world still bound to stone and sorcery. The more I looked, the more it made sense that the Vulpes might actually be the most technologically advanced of all the peoples I had seen. I did not sense the hum of enchantments or the quiet glow of wards that marked most cities. If the rest of the world moved forward on magic, then the Vulpes had walked the opposite road, one of grit and machines. Fascinating stuff, really. Were the Vulpes simply not well suited to magic? That possibility lingered as I circled, watching the smoke drift upward from crude furnaces scattered across the sprawl. If their bloodline carried little affinity for the arcane, it would explain why their culture turned so completely to steel and powder. Where others leaned on wards, charms, and runes, the Vulpes were forced to innovate in different ways, trading spellcraft for machinery. What might seem like weakness could just as easily become strength. Regardless of the cause, their technology would be useful to me. I had my own modernization efforts to push forward back in my empire, and scraps of industry like this could accelerate that vision. Even from the air, I could make out the shapes of crude factories, squat and ugly things belching black smoke into the desert sky. They were primitive, but not insignificant. To build steel in bulk meant supply chains, furnaces, and workers who understood process rather than craft. It was a degree of industrialization, however raw, and in this world that already set them apart. I had already toyed with the idea among the dwarves, but they resisted at every turn. Their minds were chained to the pursuit of perfection, obsessed with crafting artisanal masterpieces one at a time. Effective in their way, yes, but piecemeal, slow, and utterly incapable of scaling. I had to push them hard for compromise, and even then stamping machines and full industrial lines remained absent. To them, anything that did not carry the mark of the master's hand was a desecration of their craft. The Vulpus, though, seemed different. They were not trying to create the perfect sword or the flawless shield. They were trying to produce what they needed in bulk, to keep a people alive against scarcity and danger. That was a mindset I could work with. The more I studied the smoke rising from their workshops, the more I wondered if the Vulpus might be more than just gunslingers. They could be the industrial arm I needed, the missing piece that would let my empire move from experiments and compromises into true modernization. Thus far, I have been compromising with the Hive, churning out mass-produced soldiers and beasts to mimic an industrial army. Artillery, heavy armor, shock troops, all standardized and stamped out in numbers that make the battlefield predictable, with a few aces hidden in reserve. It works, it wins fights, but it is still imitation, a factory floor that copies what other worlds do without changing the rules of the game here. A true industrial revolution with magic on the table changes everything. Imagine production lines where runesmiths and foundry hands work side by side, where a press not only stamps metal but imprints a basic ward into every plate that comes out. Mix the dwarves' precision with Vulpus scale and the Hive workforce, and you get volume, quality, and the uncanny boost of enchantment. Of course, there are problems. You need to bend tradition into assembly lines. But those are solvable problems. The Vulpus give me the bones of industry. The dwarves give me the engineering eye. The Hive gives me production capacity. With those three aligned, I would not merely field armies. I would manufacture a new order. Oh my, the things I could do with that. All right, let's file that away for later. For now, I need to check on my Hive as it scours the fog. Truth be told, I had no idea where the gate was before I came here. All I knew was that it lay somewhere in Vulpina Maxima, or more accurately, what people now call the Vulpina Wastes. With half the continent shattered before my arrival, the gate could just as easily have sunk beneath the drowned half of the land. That was where Montis came in. Trying to comb through every scrap of Vulpina Maxima myself would have taken years. Vulpina Maxima had always been a catch-all phrase. In truth, it referred to the Waste's mainland, the harrowed waters, and the land of shattered bones. That was enough territory to swallow Zarima, Elysia, and Western Valyria combined. Finding the gate, roughly the size of a building, would have been like hunting for a needle in a haystack the size of a castle. Not exactly efficient. Fortunately, Montis's expedition and O'Near's intelligence narrowed it down. The gate was somewhere on the mainland of the Vulpina Wastes. Good news, yes, but that still left me with an area larger than Elysia, and not exactly easy ground to cover. With the desert sands swallowing half the ruins, the gate could easily be buried, blending in with the rubble. My Hive was spreading out regardless. If nothing else, it gave me a chance to map the land and maybe get lucky. Besides, I did not want Montis's expedition slaughtered the moment they set foot inside the fog. Reports said the fog hid vicious ether-mutated beasts, and my Hive was already taking heavy losses. Not surprising, really. Ether-mutated creatures have always been nightmares to fight. I shot toward the fog, following the coordinates that marked one of the battlefields. My Hive was already locked in a brutal fight with an ether-mutated monstrosity. When I landed heavily on the torn ground, the creature's shape came into full view. It stood on 4 limbs, each one elongated and bent at unnatural angles, the joints bulging outward as though calcified over repeated breaks. The weight of its body pressed deep craters into the soil with every step, leaving a film of moisture that seeped from open pores along its legs. Its hide was bare, the skin stretched taut and translucent in places, revealing thick networks of blackened veins that pulsed visibly beneath the surface. Across its frame were numerous growths, spherical and irregular, inflating and collapsing in a rhythm that did not match its breathing. Some of these masses twitched as if animated independently, distorting the musculature around them. The head carried 3 eyes, though not in any symmetrical pattern. 2 protruded high on the left side of the skull, slightly misaligned, while a solitary larger eye bulged from the right, its surface cloudy and veined. The jaw was set crookedly, slanting across the face as if broken and never healed, with teeth that varied wildly in size and placement. Some were needle-thin and packed too tightly, others long and uneven, growing sideways as if there had been no space for them. Along its spine, portions of bone had pierced through the skin, forming ridges that resembled splintered armor plates. The back was fissured with lesions that leaked a thin vapor when strained, the mist dispersing into the fog around it. The odor that drifted from its body was acrid, a mixture of iron, damp soil, and a faint chemical sharpness that lingered. Its movements were irregular, lacking the smooth coordination of natural musculature. The legs jerked in sudden bursts, followed by pauses where the entire frame seemed to twitch, as if uncertain of its own balance. Even in stillness, the body quivered in small, involuntary motions, as though the flesh had not fully agreed to hold together. This one was tough, my senses told me as much. But even if that wasn't the case, the piles of dead Hive soldiers next to it were more than enough proof of what it is. I told Nafas to kill as many as she could find. Their essence would be useful, mutated and ruined it may be. I raised my arm blades, and the beast locked its gaze on me. I grinned. It's been a while since I had a good fight. This is going to be fun. Chapter 2, 152. Fogged Bloodbath. I faced down that disgusting creature, the old revulsion for rampant mutation rising within me again. A feral snarl escaped my maw as I circled it, disjointed and obscene, a mass of power with no focus or design. In the back of my third brain, I could feel the irony and a vague frustration. This distaste for the font's mark, for ether running wild and warping life, is so deeply ingrained in my psyche that I cannot resist it. I can control everything except this instinct, this disgust for random, uncontrolled mutation. I reshaped my upper arms into a pair of curved blades. Not my usual mantis claws, these were heavier, longer, cleaver-like, built for brutal carving. The creature circled me in turn, its lopsided face twitching. It had torn through my Hive soldiers with ease, even a fiend lay dead in the distance. Yet this time it was cautious. Feral or not, all creatures know fear. It lunged fast, and I answered with a burst of corrupting flame. The thing shrieked as fire engulfed its head. Almost immediately, its skin began to bubble and reform. One side of its face had 2 eyes, and when the flesh sealed again, they fused into a single swollen orb. An ugly, misshapen thing, but an eye nonetheless. The creature moved first. I coiled and let it close the distance. Its weight shifted forward, center exposed. I twisted, redirecting the charge, and drove a bone blade through its side. The impact carried through its body with a satisfying crack. It recovered faster than expected, spinning with a wild slash. I pulled my torso back, the strike cutting empty air. My tail snapped back, shifting my balance, and I answered with a clean horizontal cut across its ribs. Boiling, flaming blood leaked out. Bright and volatile, it lunged again. I slid around it and struck twice more. Each blow landed where regeneration was weakest. I pressed closer, cutting with mechanical precision, neck, shoulder, abdomen. It tried to flee, dragging itself across the ground, but I caught it with my tail and pulled it back. "Where do you think you're going?" I said with a chuckle. It thrashed, trying to twist free, but the motion was weak and uncoordinated. I tightened my tail, pressure building, until the sharp crack of bone signaled the end of resistance. The next strike went in, just below the sternum. The creature convulsed once, then tried to bite. I ignored it. The teeth glanced off harmlessly as I twisted the blade upward. The chest opened with minimal effort, in a spray of flaming, ether-infused blood and scattering ribs. The heart was still beating. Larger than normal, deformed by parasitic growths that pulsed out of rhythm. Filaments of flesh coiled around it like roots strangling a tree. Normally, this would be the part I enjoyed. The heart carried the last imprint of the hunt, the taste of the life itself. But this one was wrong. The smell was wrong, the texture uneven. as if the organ had forgotten what it was supposed to be. I drove the blade straight through it. The muscle ruptured, spraying fluid thick with ether residue. The body seized once, then fell slack. No regeneration, no heartbeat. Done. I released the tail hold and let the carcass drop. Steam rose from the blood, leaving a faint metallic taste in the air. I took a moment to carve it open and examine the body. The structure was consistent with other mutated creatures, rapid growth in some areas, necrosis in others, the usual pattern of unstable ether exposure. Gross, I muttered, and turned my attention outward. Right on cue, the queen erupted from the ground. She bowed, chitin plates clattering in sequence. Well fought, my king. Get this thing below ground and start picking it apart. Not every day we get samples like this, I said, reshaping my arms back into the standard mantis claws. It shall be done, the queen replied, before burrowing down again with the carcass. I ran a quick scan across the battlefield. The hive was still engaged, the noise of combat carrying faintly through the link. Casualties were higher than expected, but within tolerance. The enemy's physiology was crude, all muscle and impulse, no strategy. Effective at first contact, but unsustainable against organized pressure. Attrition works. My hive never tires. The drones can pincushion these things with venom until the toxins do their work. Eventually, even mutation runs out of options. Continue sweep and recovery, I murmured across the link. Collect viable tissue, discard the rest. Acknowledgement rippled back through the network. I turned away from the battlefield and started moving toward the next major target. Something else was stirring there, stronger. I could almost taste the ether field bleeding from it. I lifted off, wings spreading wide as I rose through the haze. Ether distortion rippled across the landscape, the currents pulled unnaturally toward a single source. The air grew thicker as I closed in, visibility warping at the edges. A massive lumbering structure of flesh, dragging itself forward in uneven intervals. Its body tore and rebuilt itself with each movement. On its back, cratered holes opened and closed like breathing wounds. Within each, a fleshy sac swelled with fluid, pulsing in slow sync. When full, the sac ruptured, ejecting a clutch of spawn onto the ground. Regeneration began immediately after, dozens of sacs, continuous output with no downtime, just a pulsating flow of mutated flesh. Above the body, 7 necks craned outward, each ending in a malformed head. Some were alert, snapping at the air, others hung lifeless or convulsed at random. The heads moved independently, reacting with delay, confused but aggressive at nothing in particular. It actually looked like some heads had killed other heads. The entire thing was drawing ether from the air. I watched as strands of energy bled toward it in slow, deliberate motion, pulled from the ambient field and funneled into its mass. It had turned itself into a self-contained ecosystem. The surrounding land was already beginning to blister under the constant drain. Below, my hive was losing momentum. The creature was holding well. It had too much mass, and its clutches of spawn were a good counter against my hive's wave tactics. Yes, it was taking damage, but this one had uncannily powerful regeneration. I hovered higher, adjusted my spectrum, and began to map the creature's patterns. Sacs ruptured every 10 seconds. Head rotation showed blind zones, plenty of openings, plenty of ways to take this thing apart. I watched for a few more seconds, letting the rhythm settle into memory. Primitive execution. But tactically, the concept had legs. A self-sustaining combat form that produced spawn continuously, using ambient ether to generate pressure on the field. Crude, but it worked. My hive lines were stalled, not from strength, but from volume. The enemy wasn't trying to win, it was trying to bury us under bodies. I zoomed in on the sacs again. The timing was consistent. Spawn emerged with minimal structure, no variation worth tracking, no intelligence, just mass and motion. That was fine. Not every unit needs a mind. The real value was the delivery system. No birthing chambers or external infrastructure, just a lump of meat, tethered to nothing, dumping bodies directly into the fight. It was inefficient, yes. Raw ether draw always is. But internal energy stores could cover that. Run the process hot and short, burn fast, then die. I began sketching the framework in my mind. Small aerial units, low biomass and complexity, spawned in fixed templates, no randomness, equipped with minimal navigation, short-range wings or gliding membranes. One job, reach the target and detonate, not precision weapons, distractions. Enough of them and the enemy would be forced to redirect fire, split formations and waste resources. They wouldn't kill much, but they'd make the field messy. The idea had promise. The Queen could work with this. Strip the mutation, replace it with structure and scale it clean. I coiled in the air and dropped. I landed on its back only long enough to drive my blades in. The surface rippled under me, hot and unstable. No structure, no anchor, not a place worth staying. I pushed off, dropped to the ground in a tight spiral, tail absorbing the landing. The Hydra shifted, several heads tracking my descent. One moved first, a snap downward, wide sweep. I slid under it, then lunged up and caught it under the jaw with both blades. The edges sank halfway before bone slowed me. I tore out sideways and let the momentum carry me back. Another head lunged from the left. I twisted, caught the teeth on my forearm, and responded with a thrust straight into the soft tissue below the eye. The blade stuck, pulsing with resistance. I leaned into it, felt the twitching jaw go slack. A clawed limb came around next, low and heavy. I raised my tail and coiled up to deflect, then pivoted hard, slipping around the limb's arc. The tip of my blade kissed the inside of the elbow as I passed. Not enough to drop it, enough to weaken the next swing. Spawn swarmed out from under the main body, spilling from the sacks in irregular clusters. I caught one mid-charge, skewered it clean. Another jumped. I caught it in my lower arm and snapped it. The third got close enough to rake my side. It died a second later, but not before leaving a line of blood that closed immediately. I moved, circling the creature's flanks, cutting into joints and soft gaps as they opened. The heads followed, but slowly, each on its own rhythm, overlapping signals that made the whole body sluggish. I slipped behind a forelimb, then coiled and surged upward, stabbing into the armpit with both blades. One caught something critical. The limb buckled. I dropped away before the other came down. The creature roared. Several heads thrashed at once, teeth grinding over soil and bone. One struck the ground a meter from me, sending up a plume of dirt and meat. I flowed around it, struck once, then again, each hit calculated, intending to cripple rather than kill. It was trying to cover too many directions at once. I didn't need to overpower it, just stay ahead of its reflexes. I stabbed into the understructure, no sack, no brain, just meat. But even meat had limits. The creature buckled again, not from pain, from failure. I felt a rising ecstasy swell in my chest. It started as a hum, then pushed higher, sharper. I let out a laugh, low, unrestrained, as my blades flashed forward, no longer just tools, but extensions of the hunger itself. Blood from the hunt. It's been too long since I had a good kill. I carved upward in wide arcs, blades moving with precision and violence, flesh split clean, connective mass tore apart, heads thrashed above, useless now, snapping at empty air or hanging limp. The creature collapsed around me, massive limbs falling without command, its form breaking down into twitching muscle and spasming organs. A final wave of spawn spilled out and scattered, leaderless, aimless. I didn't even look at them. They were irrelevant now. I kept cutting until the twitching slowed, until the spasms faded, until nothing moved but the pooled blood steaming in the dirt. Damn, that felt good. I let out a roar, loud roar from the deepest part of me, not a warning, not a call. Just release. The sound tore up through my chest and out into the sky, all feral fury and broken restraint. A signal to the world, to the hive, to whatever still crawled nearby. Ah, that was fun. Now what is that doing over there? Sounds like a chicken, a sneaky chicken. Fuck, 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 fuck. Nally cursed, voice ragged as he tore through the fog, boots slipping over sand and shale. His lungs burned under his protective mask, and his cloak thrashed in the wind, flaring out behind him like a damn flag, telling the monsters exactly where to find him. He was a fog scaver. One of the mad bastards desperate enough to comb the mists for old-world relics, scraps of forgotten tech, shards of lost magical artifacts, anything with value. It was a job for lunatics and people with no other options. And Nally was definitely the second kind. He didn't do this for glory. He did this because his family was 1 week from getting kicked off the city ledger, and once you were off the ledger, you were gone. He'd only come out to poke around and scout, just a light run. Maybe spot some ruins. The fog was oddly quiet, no skittering, none of the usual horrors. That should have been the warning. He climbed the next dune on all fours, panting, paranoid, gut twisted in dread. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Then he saw it. Through a tear in the fog, something moved. He yanked his spyglass to his eye, fingers trembling. What he saw made his blood freeze. A creature, gold-feathered and sleek like a blade carved from light, stood over the corpse of a nightmare, some hulking brute now reduced to twitching limbs and steaming meat. Nally almost dropped the glass, his knees gave out, and he barely caught himself. His mouth was dry. His heart was slamming so hard he thought he might pass out. He was supposed to be alone out here. He wasn't even that deep. Nothing like that was supposed to be this close. He turned and ran. No plan, no grace, just raw terror, slipping, stumbling, clawing his way back over the dunes like a man half blind. "Fuck the rent," he panted, lungs on fire. "Fuck the fucking rent. This isn't about rent anymore." That thing wasn't a beast. It wasn't some territorial horror you could scare off with fire or some fancy explosives. If it kept moving, it would wander toward the city. Then it wouldn't matter who could pay rent or who couldn't. He had to get back. He had to warn them. Because if that thing came knocking, there wouldn't be a city left to get kicked out of. Then he felt a gust of wind, and a massive shadow flew over him. He looked up just in time to see that beast land in front of him. It was this enormous gold-feathered creature, still covered in blood and bile, its maw wide and filled with serrated teeth, smiling down at him. In his gut, he knew it. He was going to die. The beast opened its mouth, and he knew the next moment would be its jaws closing around him like a midday snack. "Hi there, you seem a bit irrational." Chapter 2, 153. Old Horrors. "Whoa, you are not doing so well," I said as I scanned him. He had seen better days. The mask was cracked in 3 places, fabric caked with dust, and the layered insulation bubbled where ether had eaten at the seams. That get-up offered about as much protection against ether as a fishing net does against wind. Power word, heal. I cast casually. Light licked along my hands, thin as a spiderweb, and slid into him. His skin pulsed, the bruises knitting themselves. Whatever latent ether rot clung to him, peeled away in flakes of blue smoke, and drifted off hissing like a small dying things. He stood stock still, eyes wide and unblinking. "Now then, you talk?" I asked as I loomed over him, letting my shadow swallow half his frame. My tail settled on the loose sand, and I could feel him flinch through the vibrations in the sand. "Don't eat me," he rasped. "Yeah, of course. If I wanted you dead, you would be. Now then, I have to ask what you were planning exactly, running off like that." I grinned, baring too many teeth. He swallowed, the motion visible beneath his cracked mask. "Homesick," he lied, his vitals fluttered, a tiny spike under the skin of his throat. "I can tell when you lie," I said. "I can see everything, like how your heartbeat leapt when you said it." My grin widened, playful and a little too sharp. I peered closer. "You were going to run home and eat pie," I guessed, and watched for the tell. Nothing. "Run home and tell everyone about the big scary gold monster," I tried, and his pulse jumped like a trapped animal. There it was. "All right, before you do that and force me to eat you, how about a deal?" I sank down as if taking a seat on an invisible stool. He blinked up at me, wary. "You do not have a choice, by the way," I added dryly. He jolted. He hesitated, then forced his voice out. "What deal?" "First, tell me what you are doing out here, so I can figure out how we can help each other. It is a deal, remember? You scratch my back, I scratch yours," I said as I made a little scratching motion with one of my arm blades. "I am looking for relics," the Vulpus said, voice trembling, words tasting of fear and something else, guilt perhaps, though buried under exhaustion. I tilted my head slowly, the motion deliberate, a predator's curiosity. "What for? Dangerous place to scavenge, no?" My voice carried a lazy amusement as I looked him up and down. "Rent," he murmured, barely audible. Rent? I echoed, leaning forward, my reflection glinting in the cracked lenses of his mask. If I don't pay rent, my family gets kicked out of the city, he muttered, tone half defensive, half defeated. Ah, I said, drawing out the word with a quiet grin. So you're looking for relics to sell or barter then? Perfectly rational. I passed by some ruins earlier. They looked like they might still have something left. But if I'm honest, I said, remembering the desolation, the looted shells of old ruins, the faint hum of spent ether still clinging to their bones. They've been picked clean, like carcasses stripped by crows. Then I looked back at him, grin widening. Still, scavengers always find a way, don't they? After all, sometimes you just need to look in the right place. I murmured and flicked my wrist. The air rippled like heat over metal as I shaped a spell into form. Light condensed in my palm, first a trembling outline, then a solid weight. When the glow faded, an ether-resistance amulet hung from my clawed fingers, its core stone pulsing faintly like a captured heartbeat. It wasn't a trinket. This one could survive the font itself, let alone this thin soup of fog. I jingled it lightly, the gold chains chiming in the still air. His eyes tracked it instantly, pupils dilating like a starving hound's. The faint reflection of the amulet danced across his cracked mask, and for a moment I could smell the shift in him, fear curdling, thinning, and finally giving way to want. "Tell me, Vulpus," I said, my tone slipping into something almost playful as I twirled the amulet around one finger, the chain glinting like a captured sunbeam. "What's better than a deal you don't know?" His gaze flicked up to meet mine, uncertain, the question hanging between us like bait on a hook. I caught the amulet mid-spin, the metal singing softly against my claw, and let it dangle again, swaying gently between us. A grin split my face, sharp and amused. "The deal you do." I laughed, low and warm, and the sound curled through the fog like smoke, half promise, half threat. "What do you want?" he asked, voice small, tentative. "Simple, really," I said, grin sharpening. "You run back to your little city and you do not tell them about me. Say the monsters out here are thinning, like they are killing each other. Say the fog is not as dangerous as they think. Spin it pretty, put a pause on the panic." I twirled the amulet between my fingers until the chains sang, the little metal sound cutting the silence into neat pieces. "And of course you get this." I dangled the amulet in front of him. He swallowed, found a scrap of courage, and spoke. "I have one more condition." "Oh? Interesting," I said, leaning lower, letting the shadow of my face brush his. "You leave the city alone. Do not harm it," he said. I laughed, a short, amused burst that showed too many teeth. "Of course. Why would I ask you to spread the word if I planned to destroy your little city? That would be poor form." My grin widened, half reassurance, half edge. "So do we have a deal, little Vulpus?" I asked, holding the amulet closer, letting it swing within his reach so the gold skimmed the air between us. He stared at the pendant as if it were an offering and not a bargain. His fingers twitched inside the ragged glove, a thin, tremulous sound left his throat. Finally he nodded, the motion stuttering like a faulty Magitech speaker. "Yes, I will say it," he whispered, voice small enough to be swallowed by the fog. "Good." I let the chain slip through my claws and into his hand. "Remember exactly what to say, and say it plain. No flourishes, no warnings, and definitely no mention of a gold-feathered monsters that heals people for sport." He swallowed. I could see the lie forming its new shape, dressed in enough truth to be believable. "Break that deal," I added softly, "and witnesses tend to disappear." It was not a threat dressed in thunder. It was a fact handed over like a coin. He tucked the amulet beneath his shirt as if it might burn him, then took a few stumbling steps back toward the path that led home. I watched him go until the fog swallowed his silhouette. Then I spread my wings and shot into the air. I did a quick sweep of the surrounding area at the edge of the fog, engaging my invisibility beforehand to make sure I'm not spotted. I went from city to city, exmining their frail metal frames. Like weak shacks going to be blown over, many had cobbled together walls, yes, of steel and sheet metal. Their guards patrol on the walls, ever watchful, and for good reason. Like that bandit camp over there. Looks like they were preparing for a raid. Tell you what, for old time's sake, "What the fuck is this?" Captain Wyatt muttered, scanning the wreckage of the bandit camp. It was a mess. Melted metal, tents caved in, scattered limbs where bodies should have been. Some bits were still burning. Whatever came through here didn't just kill, it butchered. And something had eaten half the corpses. He lowered his rifle slightly. Not from comfort, just thought. "Keep your eyes open, Rangers." His voice was steady but low. "Whatever walked." He paused, his boots scuffed against a long, smooth depression in the dirt. He crouched, ran his fingers across it. The soil was compacted in a clean wave. "Slithered through here is hungry," he said. "You see anything big or fucked up, you sound off. I want no surprises. Not today." "With respect, sir," one of his NCOs replied, prodding the bottom half of a corpse with his boot. "If whatever did this shows up, I'd wager we're already dead." "Love the vote of confidence, Sergeant," the Wyatt said dryly. "Just calling it like I see it, sir," his NCO replied. Wyatt gave a small grunt. "Let's just make sure we see it coming, then." He stepped past the broken body and motioned his squad forward. "Sweep the perimeter. I want full coverage and no blind spots. Whatever this was, it didn't come through quiet, and it sure as hell didn't leave clean." Captain Wyatt approached the body pinned to the wall. A bone spine as long as a sword jutted through its chest, buried deep into the stone behind it. Serrated edges ran the length of the spike. He crouched, studying the wound. Poisoned, no question. The corpse told the story. The whites of the eyes had turned black, like polished coal. Dry black blood streaked the fur along his cheeks, trailing down like tears. More of it had crusted around the muzzle, lips split, foam frozen mid-spasm. "Careful out there, whatever this is, it has venom. By the looks of things, it's not pretty if you get hit," Captain Wyatt said. Wyatt continued moving through the camp, noting the sheer devastation. Melted gear, collapsed shelters, bodies torn apart or folded in on themselves like paper. It wasn't just violence, it was efficiency. Whatever came through hadn't killed for survival, it had cleaned house. His mind turned. Whatever attacked most likely came from the fog. They had what? 20 years. That was the estimate. The fog creeping east, swallowing town after town, eating up the outer rim city by city. At first it was slow, people held out, tried to live on dead land, pump from poisoned wells, pretend it wasn't happening. But one by one, the lights went out. Towns dried up, roads cracked, the edges of the map frayed and curled like old paper left in the sun. Eventually, the line would give. And when it did, they'd have to do the old mass exodus dance again. Probably another resource war, another quiet culling. There wouldn't be enough food or water further inland. Not enough clean reservoirs, not enough logistics. Just too many mouths stacked against too little supply. Best case scenario, it happened gradually, a slow depopulation, controlled retreat, systems intact. You move industry first, then agriculture, bleed the population east over a decade or two. Let it all fold quietly. But if the fog started spewing horrors like this, that wasn't something you could outplan, that wasn't a migration. That was panic. That was roads clogged with desperate families, checkpoints overrun, supplies looted or burned. That wasn't an exodus. That was ruin. "Any survivors?" Wyatt called out. A chorus of negatives echoed back from the squad. Whatever attacked this place had been merciless and hungry. There were far more patches of blood than there were bodies. Whatever it was had eaten half the camp and left the rest to rot. Wyatt stepped over a split crate and glanced toward the remains of the old watchtower. It hadn't collapsed. It had melted. What was once a structure of reinforced steel was now just a warped pile of hardened slag slumped over like wax left too close to fire. "Think we can fight whatever did this?" one of his NCOs asked as he approached, eyes still sweeping the wreckage. "We don't even know what this is," Wyatt replied, "and judging by what's left of this place, normal tactics won't cut it." The NCO let out a short breath. "Maybe we strap explosives to our chests. If it eats one of us, we detonate inside the mouth." Wyatt glanced at him, then back to the slag heap. As fatalistic as it was, the plan had merit. "File that under last resorts," Wyatt said. "But yeah, keep that idea on standby." But for now, I think we need to get our hands on those anti-armor rifles, the ones locked up in Ranger HQ. You think Command would actually give us those? The NCO asked. Maybe, Wyatt said. They were built for killing big game. Not many left in circulation, but considering this camp got turned into a buffet, I'd say it's time we started using them as intended. What about ammo? We still got those enchanted shots, the NCO asked. Nah, we ran out decades ago. Now it's just hard brass and good aim. Wyatt paused, gaze sweeping across the dunes. Gotta hit the joints, probably. We can't make more. Lost the spells in the fall. He grimaced as he lit a cigarette, shielding the flame with his hand against the dry wind. So what now, Captain? Another NCO asked. Collect samples, scavenge what you can. Careful for the spines, I got a feeling those cut fingers off easily. Wyatt grumbled. He knelt next to a spine just left in the dirt, as long as his arm, serrated and long like a sword. Whatever can fire this at speed must have a lot of power and be quite precise as well, judging by some of the corpses he found impaled perfectly in the chest and sent flying into a wall. He had heard Captain O'Neill was heading to Ranger HQ with a delegation of humans of all things. Well, knowing O'Neill, if he is abandoning his post in the east to come here, it means these humans from beyond the mountain wall must have something worth considering. As much as he held on to his scrappy Vulpus pride of independence and grit, he couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. The fog creeping close, death following closer, monsters emerging and famine encroaching. With a sigh, he poked the blunt back of the spine with his boot and muttered, "Hope the humans have better ideas than us." Chapter 2. 154. Stories, Old and New. I stared at the odd four-legged reptile in front of me. It's an interesting natural adaptation. A large desert reptile adapted for endurance rather than speed. It is shaped much like a horse, with long limbs and a strong spine built to bear riders. Fat stored along a dorsal ridge serves as both energy and water reserve, while its webbed, padded feet spread its weight across soft sand, preventing it from sinking. Scaled skin reflects sunlight, and a network of blood vessels beneath regulates heat, allowing it to function in both scorching days and cold nights. It exhales little moisture, excretes waste as dry crystals, and can seal its nostrils and eyelids against sandstorms. Though cold-blooded in ancestry, slow muscular thermogenesis grants it limited internal warmth, making it the ideal reptilian counterpart to a camel and ideally suited as a mount for the desert's harshest reaches. I am surprised, honestly. It's the first time I have been impressed by a truly naturally adapted creature. I mean, it has been domesticated and bred into this form to some extent. But on the other hand, cozying up to another species like the Vulpus is a natural symbiotic adaptation. So I'll count it as natural, and anyone who disagrees can bite me. Or maybe I will bite them. It is a fascinating creature. It can carry riders, haul cargo, and even be slaughtered for meat, with its hide used for clothing. It's a multi-tool creature. Honestly, a potential stopgap creature for my hive. I opened my mouth and closed my jaws around the creature, swallowing it whole, and listened for that voice. Achieved Lacerta genome level, 5 out of 10. No significant adaptations acquired. Essence schematic updated. Well, that's the story most of the time nowadays. There are no more exciting evolutions. Most of the advantages will come from careful iteration, such as how every new desert hive creature now has webbed feet to help them run across the sands and heavier, front-sloped armor that is good at deflecting shots. Still, nature has a sense of humor. You can always find some neat ideas buried in a biome if you bother to look. Take this odd sand shrew. I recently saw an ugly brown thing about the size of a cat that spends its life burrowing through the dunes. It's got spikes along its rear and thick frontal scales that flare open when threatened, turning its whole body into a living wedge of sloped armor. Each scale works like a detachable plate, shedding off when struck without hurting the soft body beneath. Ingenious, really, evolution's equivalent of reactive plating, tucked away in a creature that looks like it should be squashed under a boot. The idea didn't stay a curiosity for long. I integrated it into my soldiers, and the results were beautiful in a brutal sort of way. Their armor grew into overlapping plates, each one angled forward just slightly, calibrated to the most common trajectories of incoming fire. When struck, the plates don't shatter, they redirect. Bullets glance off, beams scatter, blades slide harmlessly away. The surface geometry shifts over time, each new generation adjusting its slant by the Hive's collective memory of battle, refining toward perfect deflection. Well, let's see what else this world has in store. I've heard whispers of a dark naga by the sea. I flexed my wings, the muscles going taut, then slammed them downward. The air split with a sharp crack as I shot up, a thunderclap of motion echoing across the dunes. Sand exploded beneath the downwash as I shot upward, tearing through fog and wind alike. The desert fell away in a blur of gold and shadow, and I banked toward the shoreline. I channeled ether into my wings to go faster in a matter of minutes. I soared past the shore. I extended my wings and slowed to a calm holding pattern above the coast. Now that is interesting. The coastline wasn't a neat little line of beaches. It was a jagged, sheer cliff covered in that same black obsidian from the mountain pass. The obsidian had formed long, towering spikes, like whatever blast had hit the continent had physically scorched the crust of the continent. I banked toward the cliff and latched onto the rock face. It was smooth and hard and fought my blades with a surprising resistance. My blade cuts through most things, but this black glass took it like a challenge. I drove the tip in with a single hard strike, and sparks flew as the obsidian fractured along the blow. Tough stuff, I muttered, scanning the fissures. Pity it was so ether-charged it leaked like a bleeding star. Not very useful, honestly, too stable to be a power source and too irradiated to handle by hand. I could shove a shard on the end of an arrow and send it at someone, sure, but it would irradiate everything around the impact. Whatever land I get wouldn't be that useful. So instead of it fucking that guy in particular, it's like fuck that place in particular forever. Maybe I could use it against heaven or any grinding conflicts, just start lobbing this shit over fortifications and sit there. The ether radiation would kill everyone before long. Still a bit extreme though, like trying to save the house from a thief by burning it down. Maybe I'll table this for now. I looked around at the sweeping cliffs and spotted some odd things in the cliff face. I flew over to one of these parts, and as I scanned the obsidian, I noticed one part looked weird. I transformed one of my arms into a long pick and hacked at the obsidian surface, and to my surprise, I saw what looked to be half-melted metal wall. What is this? I transformed a hand into a blade and cut into the darkened metal and found it to be tough, but slowly I started to saw my way through the metal. Eventually, I managed to peel one side off, and I peered inside to see it was a room. Well, it was a vault, more accurately, judging by how its contents were all smashed against the far wall. I guess this room must have been ripped from its foundations and hurled at speed into this cliff. Or at least pressed hard enough that it fused into the rock. I did a quick scan and I didn't see that many rare artifacts, mostly broken arcane devices and gold. Can someone get over here and collect all of this? I said into the hive mind, and a quick wave of assent was received. All right, that's that. I'll file this away for now. Now for the main event, let's go look for Dark Naga. O'Neill grunted, snatching his hat from his head and waving it in a lazy arc at the approaching rangers. The lead ranger did the same, a mirrored gesture, before both men settled their hats back into place. Stay put, O'Neill said, digging his heels into his mount's flanks. The creature lurched forward, its scaled legs thudding over the sand with a slow, rolling power. Heat shimmered off its back as O'Neill rode ahead. When he drew close, a familiar grin met him. So they were near the base after all. Wyatt, you old shithead, O'Neill called out, voice roughened by dust and distance. Didn't think you'd still be breathing. Right back at you, you crazy bastard, Wyatt shot back, flashing his fangs. How's that cushy eastern post treating you? O'Neill barked a laugh. Got soft. Figured I'd come west and remember what sand in the teeth feels like. Wyatt's eyes flicked to the caravan behind him. So what brings the famously reckless Captain O'Neill crawling back out here? Those strange folks I see trailing behind you. O'Neill hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a metal canteen, polished and marked with the faint sigil of the Imperial line. The sun caught the silver rim as he tossed it toward Wyatt. Drink up, he said. You must be thirsty. Wyatt caught it one-handed, turning it over once. The seal on the lid made his brow twitch, recognition at the craftsmanship and something like suspicion. He unscrewed it anyway, sniffed, then took a slow pull. When he lowered it, his voice came out quieter. "That's clean." "Clean and cold," O'Neill said with a grin. "The kind they bottle in the East. Those folks beyond the range, they've got rivers that shine like mirrors, or so they say. They came bearing gifts." Wyatt raised a brow. "What kind?" "Water," O'Neill replied, lips quirking. Wyatt snorted. "Other than that?" "Food," O'Neill said, voice taking on a weight. "Canned stuff mostly, meat, fruit, even soups that don't spoil. Tastes like nothing we've got here. Then there's the medicine, real healing potions, not the watered-down sludge our apothecaries make. Fix a fever in minutes, mend a cut in seconds." He glanced back toward the caravan where the glint of metal caught the sun. "They've got tech too. Guns that don't need powder, armor that treats bullets like brittle blades thrown at granite cliffs, and magic, their kind of it. Actually works." Wyatt let out a low whistle. "Quite the haul." "Yeah," O'Neill muttered, eyes narrowing at the horizon. "And maybe, if we're lucky, a path past the range, greener lands. But you and I both know, gifts like these don't come free." "Aye, what do they want?" Wyatt asked. "The general in?" "Best to ask him," O'Neill said, his tone flat. "Their price is steep, old friend." "It involve kneeling?" Wyatt asked, his lip curling into a snarl. "Yeah," O'Neill replied, voice low. "But they're not fools. They don't expect us to swallow pretty words about compassion. They offered to send the general and a few of us officers to their empire. Let us walk the streets, talk to anyone we want." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. "Recon then? Free rein?" "Free rein," O'Neill confirmed with a nod. "At least that's what they say." O'Neill said, eyes narrowing as he turned and watched the caravan shimmer in the heat. "Don't see why they'd lie, though. Killing us back in their empire doesn't get them anything. We're not worth the bullets or the hassle." He spat into the sand, the gesture half shrug, half warning. "If they wanted us dead, they could have left us to rot out here." Wyatt gave a short nod, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Fair enough," he said, voice low and rough. He shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking. O'Neill leaned forward slightly, lowering his tone. "One more thing. They've got a hive of monsters running loose out there, and here too. Came with the expedition, all under the thumb of some ancient. They call him the Great Beast of the Elysian Woods. Thing woke up a few years back, like it crawled out of hibernation just to remind the world who owns it." Wyatt's brow creased. "Hive?" "Yeah," O'Neill said. "Not beasts like ours, smarter, organized. They move like soldiers, think like tacticians. In 3 years the eastern lands are his in all but name, and he's not alone. He's got a queen at his side. Pretty, they say, but she's no ornament. Runs the empire beside him, and from what I hear, she's got more magic in her veins and more brains in her head than all of us put together." He gave a dry chuckle, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Her empire runs like clockwork. Everyone prospers, no one goes hungry. But the ones who rebel," he tapped the side of his temple, "they end up very, very dead, and not always in ways you can bury." "How you figure this out? Doubt the delegation would be honest if they want new servants," Wyatt asked. "Asked around the camp. Grunts, scribes, logistics workers all say the same thing," O'Neill replied. "How, and I quote, the empress is the best thing to happen to Elysia and Western Valyria. Bread in every belly, wine on every table, and criminals fear her like she's a wrathful goddess." He grunted, shifting in his saddle. Stories matched up uncannily well. Too neat, maybe, but the way they said it didn't sound rehearsed, sounded like they believed it. "Still, if I were the empress, I'd send only the loyal this far out," Wyatt said, his tone thoughtful but edged. "That's what I figured too," O'Neill replied. "But bottom line, they've got plenty. Food, water, magitech, more than we've seen in years. And they're offering to let us cross the range, see the empire for ourselves," he said, eyes narrowing. "Doesn't sound like slavers to me." "That's how they get you," Wyatt replied wryly, his smile thin as paper. "Yeah," O'Neill muttered, "but we all know the fog's creeping, and we're running out of watering holes out east." He spat into the sand, jaw tight. I'd like to say we should bargain from a position of strength, but I don't see us being strong in any sense the Empire would respect. Millions under arms from what I hear. And that's not even counting the Hive, which from what I've seen and heard is their real army. The last words came out as half a growl, half an admission, the kind that tastes bitter in a soldier's mouth. The general will want to hear about this, Wyatt said, a trace of bitterness cutting through his usual calm. Aye, way above our pay grade, O'Neill replied, resting his arms on the front of his saddle. We don't get paid, O'Neill, Wyatt said dryly. Figure of speech, O'Neill grunted. For a moment neither spoke. The wind pressed at their coats, and the desert stretched silent before them. Their mounts shifted restlessly, tails flicking at the biting flies. It was the kind of quiet that came before a decision, the kind that carried weight, but no promise of good outcomes. What was that saying? Wyatt asked as he shifted in his saddle, squinting at the horizon. What? That out here in the wastes, you don't complain about getting fucked in the ass because at least you're not being spit-roasted. O'Neill replied, tone flat as sandpaper. Wyatt blinked, then gave a rough chuckle. Never heard that one before, but no. Was thinking of that card saying, you can play a bad hand and win once in a while, but if you always get bad hands, you lose more than you win on average. O'Neill gave a dry snort, half amusement, half resignation. Story of our lives, huh? The air between them felt heavier after that. Even the mounts seemed to sense it, stamping idly at the cracked ground as if looking for water that wasn't there. Wyatt sighed slightly before nodding. Yeah, story of our lives. At least this story will be interesting to the general. Chapter 2, 155. Coiled Spring. Cecilia studied the map in silence. The pattern of conflict spreading across it was not a surprise. If anything, it was the outcome she had always considered most likely. Still, anyone could look at those distant fronts and wonder why she had pushed the Empire so far. Devourer with its demon rot, the elves and their grinding forest war, Montis marching into the ashes of Vulpus Maxima, the infernal quagmire in hell, even if she was not sending fresh legions into each front. Every one of these campaigns drained her attention, her intelligence network, and the patience of her generals. Her inner circle had started to whisper the expected words: overextension, overambition, arrogance. Sarana, her spider-like spy master, had heard the muttering and reported the flavor of it. Cecilia allowed it. Dissent sharpened decision-making. As long as no one mistook her for incompetent, as long as no one entertained the thought of replacing her, they could keep their heads and their opinions. Strip away the anxious politics, and the truth remained painfully simple. Hell, Devourer, and the elven lands were all quagmires. Of course they were. Hell had dissolved into a months-long meat grinder, the lines shifting a handful of meters forward and back as the demon princes dug in. They were always paranoid and always convinced their rivals were plotting. They built entire defense systems around that fear. The elves were no better. Their ancient forest was a natural fortress. Any advance meant crawling through roots and shadows, bleeding for every inch. No one had ever conquered hell. No one had ever taken the wood of the ancients. Most believed both were impossible to breach. Expecting quick victories was a pleasant lie for the uninformed. Yet Cecilia knew what she needed. The conflict in hell had to end. She needed hell itself to break and fall into alignment with her. Once that happened, the angels would lose their position as an existential threat. They would become a peer power, not a looming doom. The wood of the ancients would open a flank against hell. Vulpus Maxima's lost gateway would offer another, a linked chain of pressure, tightening. She was pressing against a balance that had endured since before humans existed, and she knew how foolish that looked on parchment. The map seemed still, almost calm, yet to her it felt like a spring wound to the breaking point. One correct move was all it would take to snap it open. Her finger drifted to Vulpus Maxima. This front was different. This one was not a mire but a search. Here the path was still unknown, and that was precisely why it mattered. If she found the gate, everything would change. She would bring her dear friend's Hive into the open and let them pour through, and the world that had clung to its ancient stalemate would tip on its axis. The shift would not be subtle. It would be the moment the tide finally turned. She let her hand rest on the edge of the map. the faintest smile touching her lips. To her, the world was not a collection of borders and armies. It was a spell, a vast ancient lattice of forces that predated humanity, knitted together by bargains, wounds, and the slow settling of power over ages too long for mortal memory. Every realm, every plane, every pact between gods and monsters had its place in that structure. It held only because each part counterweighted the rest. Most rulers thought in terms of battles and treaties. Cecilia thought in terms of pressure points. In a spell this old, even the smallest break could unravel entire layers of reality. She did not need to topple every enemy. She needed one opening, one fracture in that delicate equilibrium. Once she had it, the unraveling would be inevitable. Hell would fall into alignment. The ancient elves would lose their sanctuary. The Hive would surge from Vulpus Maxima into the bowels of hell. The whole lattice would twist in her favor. And when it settled again, she would not simply rule an empire. She would sit over 3 worlds, sovereign of each, weaving a new order out of the remnants of the old. Her eyes shifted from the map to the banner hanging on the wall. For a moment she let herself imagine it everywhere: cities, fortresses, temples, the shattered husk of high heaven. Every roof crowned with her colors, every horizon marked with her symbol. Her gaze sharpened. The vision was not delusion to her, it was a possibility. She would do what even the old gods, wrapped in their pride and eternity, never achieved. They had shaped worlds, but never unified them. They had ruled planes, but never bound them under a single guiding will. Cecilia intended to. She could already feel the spell pattern of the world trembling under her fingertips, waiting for that single breach, that single choice that would start the cascade. When it came, her banner would rise over 3 worlds, and the age of scattered powers would end. Her eyes drifted back to the banner, then past it, toward the balcony that overlooked her capital. For an instant, she let the present blur into the future. She pictured stepping out into the open air and seeing it not as a single city, but as a symbol of something far larger. A realm so wide, so tightly bound to her will, that the sun would never find a place to rest outside her dominion. From frozen spires to burning plains, her reach would cross them all. Every rooftop would bear her banner. Every mouth would speak her name with awe or fear. The gods of old had built, destroyed, and shaped creation, yet none of them had ever held it together as one. None had ever managed to make every sunrise and sunset pass over a single sovereign. Cecilia intended to be the first. She would stand as empress of the world, and she would not stand alone. Her dearest friend would rise with her. With his power braided into hers, immortality was no longer myth, but a fact. Together they would not merely rule kingdoms, they would rule creation itself. She lowered her gaze back to the map. The candles around her flickered, as if sensing the shift in her thoughts. In the quiet, she whispered words no one but her closest companion had ever heard. Words that tasted like prophecy. My ambition will consume all of creation. Let the old world burn. I will be empress of it all. Private Don gritted his teeth as he shoved the Foshi gun toward the edge of the tree line. The wheels bumped over roots and churned through wet earth. Beside him, Private Deer let out a pained groan and pushed harder, the two of them forcing the heavy contraption into its firing position. The forest shook with the sounds of war. On one side of the river stood the full might of the Avalonian Empire. Across from them waited almost the entire elven host. Between the two forces flowed a wide stretch of dark water that had become the only thing keeping either army alive. The battle had decayed into a grinding standoff, 2 great powers hammering each other from opposite banks, day after day, night after night. The river was no longer a landmark. It had become a wound carved into the land, swollen with drifting bodies and scorched by every blast of magic hurled across it. "Get that gun into position," Don heard his officer bellow somewhere to the left. The man's once pristine cape, the proud red of Avalon's elite, had been shredded into a grimy scrap of cloth that fluttered uselessly behind him. The gun finally thudded into place. Don grabbed the front shield, braced his legs, and helped heave it upright. The slab of mithril wavered for a moment before locking into position. It was ugly, heavy, and pitted from past engagements, but it was the only thing that would keep them breathing once the shooting started. and they both knew it would start the instant he pulled the trigger. The moment this gun roared, the elves would answer. They always did. "Gun ready," Don rasped, voice raw from smoke and shouting. He staggered behind the controls as Daya slid into the far worse role, peeking over the shield's edge to guide his aim. "Get some fire across. Show those bastards Imperial fire discipline," the captain roared. "Yes, Captain," Don called back. He hauled the charging lever down with both hands. The Foci gun came alive beneath him. Runes along the barrel flared in a pale blue sequence, humming like something caged. Dia flashed her hand signals, quick and steady despite the tremor in her fingers. 15 degrees left, 6 degrees high. Don adjusted the controls. The gun's glow brightened. The air around it vibrated. He could feel the river's distant thunder running up through the soil beneath his boots. He swallowed hard, already knowing what came next. The first shot would not just announce their position, it would drag the full wrath of the elven line down on their heads. In the heartbeat before he fired, the world felt like it was waiting to see who blinked first. He pulled the trigger. The Foci gun kicked. A deep vibration rolled through its frame as it spat red bolts across the river. Don swept the muzzle left to right in deliberate arcs, trained movements meant to suppress anything on the opposite bank. Maybe they would hit someone, maybe they would just buy seconds for the squads on his side. Daya peeked over the shield, her head barely lifting above the mithril. She flashed a quick correction, half a degree higher. Enchanted arrows hissed out of the tree line across the river, streaking toward them in glittering curves. They slammed into the front shield, ringing against the mithril like hammers on anvils. Sparks spat back at Dia's face as she ducked down, skin drained of color. More arrows hit the trees behind them, and the trunks burst, showering the pair with splinters and shredded bark. The forest around them shook under the sudden storm of elven fire, and Don felt his stomach drop. Then the air changed. A deeper thrum rolled across the river as larger magic bolts arced overhead. They hit the ground with wet, explosive thuds that shook the forest floor. The elven ballista had begun its reply. "Counter battery fire," Dia shouted, voice cracking as she leaned out from behind the shield. The officer snapped his head toward her. Dia risked another glance over the top, searching for the telltale flashes on the far bank. The moment she spotted them, she ducked low and scrambled past the Foci gun, crawling across roots and churned mud toward the officer. "Coordinates," she called, breath uneven but steady enough to make the words count. She was moving through exposed ground, every heartbeat a gamble. But without her reading the flashes, their line would be blind, and blind soldiers died fast on this river. Don watched her shout the coordinates at the officer. The man nodded sharply and grabbed his communications device, barking the numbers into it while Don kept his own fire steady. Bolts leapt from the barrel in harsh pulses, lighting up the tree line ahead. Across the bank, he saw other gunners doing the same, their weapons flashing in the gloom like sparks off a giant whetstone. To his right, a rifleman crouched behind a trunk, firing into the shadowed trees in short, panicked bursts. The man barely had time to shout before a golden elven arrow punched through his helmet. The strike was so fast it almost looked clean for half a heartbeat. Then his head burst against the nearby tree in a spray of red and bone. The rifleman's body crumpled to the forest floor, twitching once before settling into stillness. Another nameless casualty feeding the river's widening wound. A heartbeat later, Don heard the Empire answer the elven ballista. Their own batteries opened up further down the line, the ground vibrating under the force of each discharge. He glanced toward the flashes just in time to see a massive red bolt crackle across the sky. It slammed into the opposite bank, and a deep blue flash erupted among the trees. Whatever the shot hit was important. Even from this distance, Don felt the shock ripple through the forest as hidden wards collapsed in a faint shiver of blue light. For a heartbeat, the guns fell quiet. In that brief lull, he heard the captain shouting into the device, "Good hit, good hit." The man sounded almost triumphant. As if answering the boast, the elves unleashed their spite. Ballistas hidden deeper in the tree line roared back to life, firing fresh volleys across the river. The first bolt slammed into the bank with a deafening crack, and then more followed, streaking through the air like jagged luminous spears. The ground shook around Don as the Empire's side of the line lit up once more. Don gripped the controls and dragged the gun back into action, red bolts tearing across the river once more. The barrel hissed, steam curling from its surface as the runes along its length glowed hotter and hotter. Even through his gloves he felt the heat building, a rising pulse that made his palms ache. Then the gun sputtered and died. "Fuck," Don hissed, jerking his hands back as the glow dimmed. He leaned in, searching for the fault through the rising heat haze. Dyer sprinted back to him, skidding behind the mithril plate. Together they scrambled over the weapon, hands moving fast, looking for whatever had jammed or burned out. Arrows kept slamming into the front shield, each impact sending sharp jolts through the metal and showering them with flecks of bark and soil. The shield rang like a cracked bell, but neither of them could afford to look up. "Get that gun in order," the officer shouted, snapping off a shot across the river without even looking back. "Trying," Dia yelled, already elbow-deep in the mess of runes and scorched metal. "There, the capacitor," Don barked, spotting a charred piece half melted into its housing. "Get the spare," Dia snapped, fingers already working to wrench the burnt component free. Arrows kept slamming into the shield as they worked, each impact rattling through the gun's frame and through their bones. The air smelled of ozone, burnt bark and panic. Dia's hands didn't stop. Don dug into the kit for the replacement, praying he grabbed the right one before the next volley found them. Then a bad hit slammed into the shield. The impact tore a glowing chunk clean off, sending the red-hot fragment spinning back into a tree trunk where it hissed and burned into the bark. "Shield compromised," Don shouted. The officer took one look at the shattered gap and gestured sharply for them to fall back. Without a fully functioning shield, the gun was suicide. Any significant structural crack meant the enchantment was gone. Don and Dia dropped the broken capacitor at the same time. There was no point fixing anything now. Together they grabbed the handles and began hauling the heavy weapon away from the line. Again, for the 16th time this miserable week, the mud clutched at their boots, arrows thudded into the ground behind them. Through the exhaustion and the ringing in his skull, all Don could think about was how normal this had become. How easy it was to slip into the rhythm of dragging the same battered gun through the same shredded forest while the world screamed on both sides of the river. Empress Cecilia's war ground on, and they were still here, hauling dead weight through hell. "For the Empire," Don muttered through clenched teeth as they pulled. Dia shot him a tired, sour look and let out her own reply, flat as cold iron. "For the Empress." Chapter 2, 156, Fort Rolve. O'Neill slid off his mount with the irritation of a man denied both breakfast and a good night's sleep. The walls of Fort Rolve loomed above him, old stone stacked into a frown. Rifles bristled along the battlements, all of them angled straight at his skull, which only deepened his scowl. "State your business," a guard barked from above. O'Neill cupped his hands around his mouth and unleashed a reply that rattled the dust. "Shut up, you dumb sack of bricks." The rifles twitched. A few helmets ducked. Captain Wyatt, standing just beside him, did not. He gave O'Neill a sideways look that carried the weary grace of great but finite patience. "Charming as always," Wyatt said, voice flat enough to be used as a tabletop. The wind carried O'Neill's snort back up to the walls, a little reminder that trouble, once again, had arrived on schedule. Reporting to the General, Captain Wyatt and Captain O'Neill. Wyatt called out, projecting his voice with the crisp authority of someone trying very hard to ignore the walking, talking court-martial beside him. "And who the fuck are they?" The guard on the parapet yelled back. Both captains turned. A short distance behind them stood the Avalon delegation, arranged with stiff politeness that suggested they wished they were anywhere else. Their mages had taken up the front rank, palms raised, maintaining a shimmering barrier that was about as subtle as a parade drum. Its glow rippled over their faces, lending each mage the look of someone who expected a siege, a betrayal, or at the very least a spectacular misunderstanding. O'Neill gave the barrier a long, unimpressed stare, the sort of look usually reserved for questionable tavern stew. Wyatt sighed through his nose in that ancient, weary fashion of a man who long ago accepted that he alone must shepherd fools through a hostile world. "Friends," Wyatt called up to the wall, doing his best impression of diplomacy. "The fuck? That looked like friends to you?" "They got magic," the guard hollered back. A few of the Avalon mages shifted, their barrier pulsing faintly as if offended on principle. O'Neill rolled his shoulders, already halfway to shouting something that would make the situation worse. Wyatt shot him a warning glance, a silent plea for the universe to give him 5 minutes of sanity before the next explosion of idiocy. Wyatt drew in a long breath, the kind a man takes when he is moments from either diplomacy or homicide. His patience frayed, he cupped his hands and bellowed toward the wall. "Just get the general. I know where you live, Sandy." A hush rolled across the battlements. Rifles wavered. Someone let out a nervous cough. The Avalon mages glanced at one another, unsure whether this was a threat, a joke, or some foreign ritual of military familiarity. Up on the wall, a single helmet dipped out of sight with the defeated slump of a man who very much did know that Wyatt knew where he lived. "For fuck's sake," Wyatt muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose as they waited. O'Neill, meanwhile, stood with arms folded and a proud scowl, looking for all the world like a man convinced he had just handled things perfectly. Behind them, the Avalon mages held their barrier with polite tension, silently judging everyone present. The air settled into a thick quiet, heavy with the promise that whatever came next would be deeply inconvenient for Wyatt alone. The wait lasted all of 5 minutes before the gates groaned open and presented them with a welcoming committee of rifle barrels. A whole wall of them, all pointed directly at Wyatt and O'Neill. "Oh, for fuck's sake," Wyatt muttered again, because the universe clearly demanded repetition. "I'm a captain. You just sent me on patrol 4 hours ago," he shouted, throwing his arms up like a man trying to negotiate with a stubborn deity. "They got magic," Sandy yelled back, somehow managing to sound both terrified and proud, his pistol aimed squarely at Wyatt's chest. O'Neill leaned in beside him, voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "You know, if you want someone paranoid to guard Fort Rolve, ain't no one better than Sandy." Wyatt didn't answer. He was too busy reconsidering every career choice that had delivered him to this moment, hemmed in by rifles, jittery mages, and the concentrated stupidity of men he technically outranked. "Sandy, put your gun down, you idiot." The bark cut through the tension like a blade. The entire firing line froze. Then, as if struck by a single collective thought, every soldier lowered their weapon and turned toward the voice. The ranks parted. Out stepped a weathered old vulpus, fur gone grey at the edges, yet still thick, ears sharp and upright. His presence had weight, the kind that made even the air remember its manners. His eyes swept the gathered cluster of panicked men with the unimpressed judgment of someone who had survived wars, disasters, and far too many fools. "General," Sandy squeaked, snapping into a salute so fast it nearly dislocated his shoulder. "Pipe down, boy. Back to your post." The general's growl was low and gravelly, the sound of stones grinding in an old riverbed. "But, sir," Sandy began, courage flickering on and off like a faulty lantern. The general turned a single eye on him. Among the troops, it is said the general's glare can flay skin. It can't, of course, but the troops shut up regardless. Whatever that look was, it was enough. Sandy swallowed hard. "As you say, sir," Sandy yelped, scrambling to wave his men back to their posts with the frantic energy of a man hoping speed would mask humiliation. "How the fuck did twitchy Sandy get promoted to lieutenant?" O'Neill muttered, watching the man scurry off like a startled beetle. "The Rangers must be really going to the dogs if he's guarding the place," he added, tone ripe with judgment. "You just said he wasn't a bad choice," Wyatt replied, voice dry enough to desiccate a cactus. "That was a professional opinion," O'Neill grunted. "And what's the other part? The I kicked him down a flight of stairs when I was 16 opinion," Wyatt asked, every syllable radiating that trademark deadpan. O'Neill's snort was practically a confession. Wyatt stared ahead, already regretting every minute of the rest of day preemptively. "O'Neill, why are you back here? I sent you east to keep you out of trouble. You missed the front so much you came running back to it," the general growled as he approached. "Ran into some interesting folk," O'Neill said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder toward the Avalon delegation. "I noticed," the general replied, tone dry enough to flake, as he stalked past the captains and headed straight for the delegation. "General," Sandy shouted from the battlements. "Shut up, Lieutenant. Man your post," the general barked back before Sandy could get another syllable out. The two captains turned and followed their commanding officer out through the gates and toward the delegation. Seeing you two together is enough to make Sandy kneel in the torchlight at midnight. You know that, right? The general growled. He's just dramatic, General, O'Neill replied, waving it off as if Sandy's metaphorical midnight terror rituals were perfectly normal. Can't say I agree or disagree with that, Captain, the general grunted. The general approached the delegation, and from their front strode General Montis, flanked by two wardens in enchanted Magitech armor. They were plated head to toe, every inch gleaming, each one standing just shy of 2 meters and radiating the kind of stillness that suggested they could break a man in half without raising their voice. General Montis gave a calm, precise salute before introducing himself. Grand General Montis, Avalonian Empire, Imperial First Army. General Abel, commander of the Vulpina Rangers, Abel replied, returning the salute with one of his own. Now, may I ask what your well-dressed self is doing in front of my fort with mages? Abel asked, his snout twitching and his eyes narrowing as he took in Montis's ornate attire, all gold trimmings and a flowing red cape. Diplomacy, Montis replied, tone still formal. He adjusted one gauntlet as he spoke, as if the matter were routine. I had a brief conversation with your officer, Captain O'Neill, and assisted in the liberation of several slaves held by your local outlaws. Abel turned to look at O'Neill, his ear giving the slightest twitch as he weighed the claim. O'Neill gave a short nod in answer. Then, before Abel could form the next unspoken question, he added a small shrug and jabbed a thumb at the over 2-meter-tall wardens. The gesture was lazy, almost bored. Yes, they helped, and yes, they were useful. Those suits deflect bullets? Abel asked. His eyes narrowed as he shifted his weight, tail giving a slow flick in thought. Among other things, Montis replied. He straightened a fold in his cape, his voice as dry as ever, as if the subject required nothing more. So what do you want? Abel asked, a low grunt under his words as he gestured at one of the wardens with a flick of his hand. I don't see what I can offer you, not when your soldiers look like that. Perhaps we can speak inside your fortress, Montis said, neatly changing the subject. This hardly seems the place for diplomacy. Abel paused. His older eyes swept over Montis, steady and measuring, and his snout gave a small twitch, as if testing the air for falsehoods. Montis held his gaze. He had no idea if the Vulpus could truly smell lies, but watching Abel now, he suspected that with enough training, they might come uncomfortably close. Fine, come on then, Abel said, turning back toward the gates. Montis stepped forward to follow. Behind him, O'Neill and Wyatt exchanged a few quick hand signs to the men waiting in the wings. The Rangers shifted into motion, checking gear and tightening straps, preparing to escort the Avalon delegation into Fort Rolve. As the group neared the gate, Sandy's voice rang down from the battlements. General, are you sure? Shut up, Sandy, Abel barked without breaking stride, marching straight through the open gate. Nice to see you too, Twitchy, O'Neill called up with a laugh. Wyatt gave him a quick punch to the shoulder, a silent warning to leave the poor kid alone before he jumped clean off the battlements. The kid's trying his best, Wyatt said, giving O'Neill a pointed look. He's always trying his best. Doesn't mean he ain't twitchy, O'Neill replied with a grin, tucking a cigarette between his teeth. Montis took a moment to turn and study the two Vulpus officers. O'Neill was a rough, half-feral mess of an individual, the sort who radiated trouble even when he was behaving. If Montis had to place him in the Imperial Army, he'd put him with the commandos or the raiders, maybe the shock troops. Men like that were useless on a parade ground and indispensable everywhere else. Wyatt was the opposite, solid, steady, the kind you wanted on the line when things started to crack. Montis could see it in the way the two moved. O'Neill walked ahead with a cigarette in his teeth and a long gun slung over his shoulder like he owned the fort. Wyatt kept his rifle held in both hands, posture tight, eyes moving, ready for whatever came next. As for General Abel, Montis liked this one. It was rare enough to find senior officers with real combat carved into their bones, but Abel carried it plainly. There was a steadiness about him, a kind of quiet hardness. Montes had the distinct impression that if the sky split open and rained demons, Abel would simply square his shoulders and tell his men to adjust their formation. And Sandy, well, the boy had heart. Montes could see that much. It wasn't nothing. It also went a long way toward explaining why he had been given a rear echelon post, somewhere his nerves could jump without taking the whole battle with them. With that quick assessment finished, Montes turned and continued after General Abel. The Vulpina wastes were proving to be a surprising goldmine of talent. The Rangers in particular stood out. Rough around the edges, yes, but impressive. They filled a role the Avalonian army often struggled to staff, the kind better suited to men who thrived in the dark. Commandos, raiders, saboteurs. When Montes reached Abel's office, both men paused at the threshold for a moment. Abel gave a short gesture toward a chair. Montes nodded and took the offered seat without ceremony. "If you've got something to say it," Abel said gruffly. "Direct," Montes noted with a small nod. Then, just as plainly, "It's simple. We offer protection, and in return, we ask a favor." "Protection," Abel grunted. "My first instinct is to be offended. Sounds like you're talking about those outlaws. But you aren't that stupid, are you?" "No," Montes replied, unfazed. "I'm not talking about outlaws. I'm talking about something you can't fight. This land, the dead soil, the creeping ether fog, that you can't beat." He leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "How long until you have to abandon this place? How long before you're forced to move again, and again, until the fog drives you straight into that mountain range?" 2 to 3 generations, Abel grunted. "Maybe 4 if we're lucky." Montes raised a brow, a surprisingly frank answer. It told him more than Abel likely meant to. The Vulpes didn't speak of death with dread, not even of a slow one creeping across their homeland. To them, it wasn't a looming terror worthy of panic. It was just a reality to endure. "It's old news. Every last one of us knows we'll die out sooner or later. We just live day by day until there's nothing left," Abel said, voice dry as dust. "Fatalistic," Montes observed. "Realistic," Abel countered, one brow lifting. "Fair," Montes conceded. "Thought so," Abel grunted. "If I had to wager, and I was a betting man in my youth, you've got a way to get my people past the mountains. Into greener pastures, I assume," Abel said as he picked up a cigarette. "Mind if I smoke?" he added. "No," Montes replied calmly, gesturing for him to continue. "Bet Captain O'Neill never asked," Abel grumbled as he struck a match and lit the cigarette. "No, he did not," Montes replied, just as dry. "I'm inclined to agree," Abel growled, "but first, let's hear your price. O'Neill didn't say jack shit, and that gives me conniptions." "We need to locate the world gate that leads to hell," Montes said. Abel froze mid-drag, cigarette hanging between 2 fingers. He let out a long sigh, took a slower pull, and muttered one word under his breath. "Fuck." Chapter 2. 157, Into the Deep. Montes glanced down as Abel spread the map across the table. A thick, uneven line cut across it, marking where the fog crept and where the land was still safe enough to stand on. What caught Montes's attention was how much of Vulpes Maxima lay under that grey stain. More than half. Searching in terrain like that would be slow, exhausting, and merciless. "All right," Abel said, tapping a claw against the parchment. "The gate, as far as we know, is somewhere up northwest." He dragged his finger across the map, then jabbed at the color blocks. "You'll notice a few colors. Pale green is us, the sane folk. Red is the raider lunatics. Grey is the fog." His finger paused over the darkest regions. "Black is dark naga. That means stay the fuck away." The map told the story plainly. Finding the gate was not just difficult. It meant threading through madness, poisoned land, and things best left unnamed. "Problematic," Montes muttered. "Yeah," Abel growled. "Problematic." "As for the distance," Montes noted, tracing the map with a finger, "it's roughly twice what we covered reaching Fort Rolve." "More or less," Abel grunted, "and that's assuming the gate's even on land. We don't actually know where it is, just the general area. That marker sits uncomfortably close to the shoreline. Could be in the sea for all we know." "Any eyes on it in recent years?" Montes asked. "Nope," Abel grunted. Decades, Montis tried. Nope. Montis exhaled slowly. Recent memory? Nope. He paused, fingers still on the map. So we have no idea where it is. Or if it's even on land. Abel didn't correct him. All right then, when was the last time anyone actually saw it? Montis pressed. Couldn't tell you, Abel muttered. He reached for a worn book, flipped it open and slid it across the table. This is all we've got. Montis studied the drawing. It matched the known world gates in form, dark stone, a massive arch rising from the ground. But unlike the active gates, the archway was empty. No swirling mass, no light. Just a hollow span of stone, inert and waiting. Does this at least mean it's on land? Montis ventured, hopeful despite himself. We don't know when that drawing was made, Abel replied dryly. But there's something there that makes things more complicated. Montis looked again. He missed it the first time, too accustomed to seeing it back home to question it. On a second pass, it stood out unmistakably. Grass. The gate stood amid open green fields. Montis hadn't seen a single leaf since entering the Vulpina wastes. Whatever the Great Fall had been, it had stripped this land down to dust and ether scar, which meant the drawing was old. Very old. Montis paused, then looked back up. You still haven't told me whether you agree to the terms. Agreeing is one thing, Abel replied. Getting you there is another. He gestured at the map with 2 fingers. The distance through the fog is too far. He tapped the grey stretch again. No way stations, no resupply, nothing. We'd run out of water long before we ever reached the gate, and even if we hauled stores with us, the ether would foul it before we got halfway. Abel leaned back in his chair, the wood giving a tired creak beneath his weight. Smoke curled from the cigarette between his fingers as he stared at the map, eyes distant. So yeah, I agree, he growled at last, if that means anything. I can't help you right now, but I agree to help if I can, assuming you don't march me and my men straight into a death trap. Montis blinked once. Me? You're going? Abel looked up then, ears angling forward, gaze sharp despite the fatigue carved into his face. You're here, ain't you, he said, and you really think I'm going to send my own men into the fog while I sit behind stone walls and get fat? He ground the cigarette out in a tray with deliberate pressure. These rangers follow me because they know I'll be at the front when it turns bad. Moment that stops being true, I don't deserve the chair. Montis studied him in silence. This was not bluster, not pride, just a line Abel would not cross, even if the Empire dangled salvation on the other side of the mountains. That, more than anything else said in the room, told Montis exactly why the Vulpina Rangers were still standing at all. So what happens if you die? Montis pressed. Who honors this agreement? Abel snorted softly, smoke drifting from his nostrils. Practical question. He reached for the map again, not looking up as he spoke. Wyatt will. Or whoever's left standing that knows how to read and hasn't lost their nerve. His finger paused on Fort Rolve. The Rangers don't fall apart because one bastard drops dead. They've buried enough generals to learn that lesson. Montis studied him. You're certain of that? I'm certain they'll try, Abel replied, and that's more than most outfits manage. He finally looked up, eyes hard. If I die, the deal stands. If all of us die, then it doesn't matter anyway, does it? But all this talk don't matter, Abel added, voice low as he tapped the map one last time. We can't get to it anyway. You leave that to me, Montis said. Abel snorted. No death traps, remember? We can't just go overland through the fog. Yes, Montis replied evenly. We can't go overland. The supplies at least. Abel looked at him then, one brow lifting. What, you planning to fly? Montis shook his head once. Think lower. Abel's ears twitched. He waited. Tunnels, Montis said. The Imperium has burrowing hives. He met Abel's gaze. The fog poisons the surface. Underground, it's manageable. Abel stared at him for a moment, then let out a slow breath. Fuck, he muttered. So, Montis asked, one brow lifting slightly, does that yes still stand? Abel didn't answer immediately. He tapped the map once with a claw, then looked back up. And what's to stop your hive from abandoning us out there? Montis's expression didn't change. "Believe me, you don't need to be underground for them to kill you," he replied dryly. "If they wanted you dead, they could reach you up here just fine." Abel held his gaze, weighing that. Finally he grunted. Not agreement yet, but not a refusal either. How long before the tunnels are dug? I soared above the waves, then plunged straight into the dark, brackish water. Visibility vanished instantly for any normal set of eyes. For me, it meant nothing. I wasn't looking with sight anyway. I was hunting ether wakes, residual concentrations. The scars things leave behind when they die dramatically. Logically speaking, land does not end up this ruined unless something big happens. Very big. My wager is a dead firstborn, something old, powerful, and unfortunate enough to die here. Much like my handsome self, though I should clarify I am not dead nor unfortunate. Obviously, I am far too young and far too handsome for that. Still, when something that ancient and that dangerous gets killed, it leaks ether everywhere. It bleeds into the soil, the air, the sea. You can't hide it. You just take one look at the map and anyone with basic deduction can tell that most of Vulpina Maxima wasn't worn down. It was shattered. I mean, it's quite obvious, just looking at it. You can practically trace the old coastline with your finger. Around the Serpent Isles, then curving up through the land of shattered bones, before it finally joins with Umbara. It all fits too neatly to be coincidence. Seas don't retreat like that on their own. Continents don't just decide to break unless something convinces them very firmly. I followed the ether wakes downward, deeper and deeper, until the water pressed in on itself and light ceased to matter at all. This was no longer a place for sight in the ordinary sense. Distance was measured in pressure and darkness. That's when I sensed them. Large shapes moved ahead of me, far off but unmistakable, their passage sending slow, heavy pressure ripples through the water. Not frantic, deliberate in the way creatures are when born for this environment. Dark naga, even at depth, their scale was impossible to miss. They were kin to the common naga, hulking, muscular creatures built to wield weapons like siege tools. But these were bigger still. Broader through the chest, thicker through the tail, their bodies armored in dark scales that swallowed what little ether light bled through the water. Heavy weapons were secured against their bodies, designed to function even here where most metal became an anchor. They paused just long enough to turn and face me, then they charged. Massive bodies drove forward through the dark, heavy weapons, coming up as if the water offered no resistance at all. Their jaws split wide, teeth bared in what felt like some ancient, inherited fury. Very dramatic. I'll give them that. I grabbed the first one that reached me. For all their bulk, for all that hulking muscle and armor, it fit easily in my hand. It thrashed, tail lashing, weapon scraping uselessly against my grip. With my other hand, I struck the second one aside, not a blow so much as a correction. Its body snapped backward in the water, spine shattering and folding the wrong way, with a wet finality as the rest of it followed, momentum carrying a corpse where a threat had been a moment earlier. I tightened my grip on the one I was holding, feeling bones crack and resistance fail, and wondered briefly why they had thought numbers would help them here. A few others slammed into me, weapons striking hard enough that a human would have vanished in a cloud of blood and regret. Against me, they glanced off hardened carapace and slid uselessly across my feathers, not even ruffling them. I barely noticed. I tossed the limp one into my mouth and bit down. Immediately that familiar voice chimed in at the back of my mind, helpfully informing me that the Dark Naga genome had been acquired and stored. As expected, there were no new adaptations worth noting. Predictable, really, big, angry, and durable, but nothing I didn't already have in better form. I flexed my main arms and opened the channels, ether surging through me in a familiar, comfortable rush. Then I released it. The blast tore through the water in branching arcs, lancing ether lightning crackling outward in every direction. The sea itself screamed as it boiled, shockwaves rolling through the depths. Dark Naga caught in it spasmed and writhed, mouths opening in silent howls as the current cooked them alive, flesh searing and muscle locking up like crustaceans dropped straight into a pot. The water filled with drifting shapes and heat haze, resistance collapsing into nothing. I sensed more shapes further out, faint disturbances in the water. The moment they realized what had happened, they turned and fled. Fast. Not in panic exactly, but with purpose. Survivors always run to tell someone. I had heard the Dark Naga only respected strength. That negotiation, threats, or diplomacy meant nothing to them unless it was backed by overwhelming force. If that was true, then flashboiling a few dozen of their kin should serve as a perfectly adequate introduction. Let them report what they saw. Let them argue about it. Either way, the message would travel faster than I ever could. Now then, back to the real work. I turned my attention to the ether wakes and continued downward. The deeper I went, the thicker it became. Not water anymore, not really. Ether saturated everything, clinging to the currents, pooling in slow-moving layers. Before long, it felt less like swimming and more like pushing through ether soup. Dense, heavy, alive in an unpleasant way. The kind of contamination that seeps into things and stays there. Something had bled out down here, a lot of something. It wasn't long before I ran into what passed for a defensive line. Dark Naga arranged in depth along the seabed, no longer charging blindly, heavy weapons braced and bodies angled outward. Not a patrol, a perimeter. That alone told me I was close. Beyond them, resting on the sea floor, lay the source of it all. A corpse so vast it warped the water around it. A hulking mass the size of an island collapsed into the silt. On the ether spectrum, it burned like a sun, radiation bleeding off in slow, violent waves that stained everything nearby. Whatever had shattered Vulpina Maxima hadn't vanished. It was still here, rotting at the bottom of the world, poisoning sea and land alike. A firstborn corpse does that. Even dead, it refuses to be quiet. Interestingly, the Dark Naga seemed to be guarding it. Why, I wasn't entirely sure. I drifted closer and spoke to them directly. The one I had eaten earlier had provided enough of their language to make that possible. Why do you guard my dead kin? The word kin rippled through several exchanged glances, a brief instinctive check between veterans, and for a fraction of a moment their weapons lowered before snapping back into place. That reaction told me enough. These were not mere scavengers or opportunists. They were loyalists, or at least descendants of those who once were, bound not by fear alone, but by something older and harder to break. Firstborn loyalists, I stated, swimming closer. The cordon reacted immediately. Dark Naga backed away in a controlled retreat, bodies angling aside to open space rather than block it. Weapons stayed raised, but the intent had changed, not challenge. Deference mixed with caution. Are you all mute? I asked. I decided to stop pretending. My body unfolded, shedding the simple 6-meter disguise as I expanded into my true form. Plates slid and locked, mass compounding on itself until I filled the water with my presence. 30 meters of hardened frame and weaponized anatomy pressed into the depths, the sea groaning under the sudden displacement. My mantis blades extended fully, each one nearly the length of a ship, edges humming with contained ether. The Dark Naga recoiled as one, the cordon breaking as instinct finally overruled discipline. Whatever uncertainty they had left evaporated in the face of something they recognized not as a threat, but as a superior. Now they understood exactly who was asking the question. One of the Dark Naga advanced alone. A veteran by the look of it. Larger than the rest, armor worked with care rather than haste, and a weapon that gleamed with age and use rather than polish. Old strength, not decorative strength. You are old one, the Naga said, voice rough and heavy with pressure. New one, I replied, baring my fangs in something that might generously be called a grin. The Naga fell silent. It stood there, considering the statement as if it were a weight placed carefully in its hands, turning it over, testing how much it bent the world around it. It pointed toward the glowing mass resting on the sea floor, voice low and reverent. You seek the fallen old one? I looked past it, down at the corpse burning on the ether spectrum like a wound that refused to close. I considered my reply carefully. Ancient beings are expected to carry a certain weight in their words. Ominous phrasing, proper menace, something that sounded like it belonged carved into stone tablets. Yep,